Hi class, welcome to the first video lecture. The process is you're going to watch my lecture videos and you would take notes while you watch it. It's as if you are a face-to-face class. You would take the notes while you watch it, and or you could pause at any point, and then you would do the homework. It'll mirror what the content of that chapter is. Okay, so this will be video 1, which is I'm going to combine chapter 1 and 2. Chapter 1 is an introductory chapter. I'm only going to do a couple of things. And then chapter 2 is, the next chapter is about the PPF, combining the scarcity and choice. Okay, so I'm going to combine those two lectures in one outline. Okay, so here it goes. So I'm going to first talk about what is economics, then positive versus normative analysis. What are resources, scarcity of resources and choices, opportunity costs. I'm going to define them. We'll do an example, and we're going to talk all about the graph. It's going to be called PPF. I'll explain that when we get there. And then we're going to do types of PPF. I'm going to let you copy this, and you can pause. I'm only going to give you some seconds and then come back. Remember, you can pause and erase this, and we're going to start it. Okay? All right, one thing I want to say is, there's two separate textbooks for macro and micro, but the first 3 lectures are the same, whether you're taking macro or micro. For macro, these are all in one chapter, chapter 1. In micro, the textbook, it's in chapter 1 and 2. Okay, so just so that you know. But whether you take macro or micro, the first 3 videos are the same because the content is the same for the first 3 videos. After that, macro and micro split up into 2 separate topics. Okay, so I'm just going to erase this and then we're going to start. All right, so what is economics? For those of you who are first taking macro and haven't taken micro, and vice versa, what is economics? So what is economics is basically, what is it a study of? A lot of people, when they see economics, the word economics, you think of money, you think it's a study of money. Well, it's specifically the study of choices. It's what choices you make with your resources, with your money, given the scarcity of your resources. So what are the choices? It's the study of choices. The choices you make, given the scarcity of your resources. Okay, and we're going to come to what that means in a bit. So what are the choices you make given the amount of resources you have? That is what economics is. And so what we have is a macro and micro economics. Macroeconomics is basically, think of macro as big. So this will be the study of choices of government makes. So we will study the choices government makes. So you're going to study tax policy, spending policy, fiscal policy, the policies the Federal Reserve makes. So these are the choices government makes. That's macro. Micro, we are going to study the choices consumers and business make. Okay, so the choices consumers and business make is micro. So that's the difference between macro and micro. Okay? So number 2 in your outline is something called positive versus normative analysis. So when we talk about economics, we always think of it in terms of positive versus normative. The positive basically is what is. Positive is what is. What is the unemployment rate? Right? If the unemployment rate is 4%, 5%, 10%, what is the unemployment rate? So if the unemployment rate is 10%, you say the unemployment rate is 10%. That is a positive analysis. That means it's what is, based on data, based on logic, it's what is. Okay? What normative is what should be. Okay, so normative is what should be. Okay, what should be. So, if the unemployment rate is 10%, and of course, at the time you watch this video, the unemployment rates are different, so I'm just making a hypothetical analysis here that, let's say the unemployment rate is 10%, you would say it is 10%. That's not a positive analysis. And you say, well, the unemployment rate should be at full employment, and let's say the full employment rate is 4%. We will study that you will study that at you study that in macro. So that is what should be. So what should be is normative, and we want to figure out policies that go from what is to what should be, and that is positive versus normative analysis. I'll just step out, have you copy a few seconds here, and then come back and we will start the PPF lecture. Okay. All right. So number 3 on the outline was what are resources. Okay, number 3 on the outline is what are resources. Okay, what are resources? So resources, sometimes called inputs, right? Factors of production, just different names. Right, is what you use or need to use to make your choices. Another way to think about it is when, for businesses, what do they use to make the choices? Okay? So their choices is they want to produce how much, what is it they want to produce? How much of tables and chairs do they want to produce? So what do they use to make the choices? So for businesses, they use labor, they use capital, they use something called land, right? And you can think of it as they use entrepreneurship. What is entrepreneurship? It's basically the owner, I mean the person who, you know, has the idea, comes up with a business. So let me talk about labor. Labor is you and I, there's skilled labor, unskilled labor, there's different kinds of labor. Usually we just think of it as, you know, how easily substitutable. Capital is both physical capital, which is, you know, capital as in tools and machinery that you need to make the product, to make the tables and chairs, as well as finance capital, the amount which is what we call investment, the amount that you would need to go to the bank, borrow from the bank, and invest in your company. Land is raw materials, okay? But it doesn't have to be just material that come out of the land. It's whatever raw material you use to make your product. So if you are using cheese and tomato to make the sandwich and you're a sandwich shop, that cheese and tomato is considered raw material. So what is it that you need? So this is what we call resources for businesses, right? For individuals, for you and I, what are resources? When we think of resources, we really think of income, our money, and, you know, time. Sometimes time is money. So really, if you think time is money, then our resources are income. So based on our income, based on this, our resources, what choices do we make? So that is for individuals, okay? So I'm just listing it for the businesses. I'll let you copy this and move out of the way, okay? All right, so now let's talk about scarcity of these resources. So that's number 4 on our outline. Let's talk about number 4 on our outline, which is the scarcity of the resources. Okay? So what do we mean by the word scarcity? Okay, we have this assumption in economics that all resources are always scarce, or there is always scarcity of resources. Okay? It means we believe there's always scarcity of labor, capital, land, and entrepreneurship. So what do we mean by scarcity? A lot of you, when you think of the word scarcity, you think of it as, oh, small amount. You think of it a limited amount. Actually, the word scarcity here means limit. It's more, I want you to think of it as word limit, not so much limited, limit. In other words, there's a boundary, there's a finite limit. So that's what scarcity is. Now that limit can be a larger limit or a smaller limit. It means there's a limit. So given your limit of your income, you make your choices, and that's economics. So the limit to labor. So there's a limit to labor because there's a limit to the population, right? So it's a scarcity of labor, right? So at any one point in time, a firm, a company, a business has a limit to how much labor they have at that moment. So given that number of labor, that number of hours they have to make decisions on, you know, what they're going to produce, how much they're going to produce, and allocation of all that. So capital has a limit to capital, actually physical capital or finance capital. You can't borrow unlimited amount. So there is a finite amount. So that finite amount can be, you know, somebody who has 10 million investment that they borrow from the bank, or 50 million investment. It's not the number, it's that there is that finite boundary. Okay, and with that you have to make choices. Land, raw materials, there's a limit to land. If you want to think of it in terms of earth, well, there's a limit, you know, the size of earth, but not all of that is land. So there's a limit to actual raw material at any one point in time that a company has, right? And so we believe there is always scarcity of resources. Okay, so if you believe there's always scarcity of resources, you have to always make choices. Okay, a firm, a company has to always make choices. Okay, the choices they are making is what to produce, how much to produce, how to produce. So a firm, a company is thinking, what do I make? Should I make tables and chairs? Do I have the resources for both tables and chairs? How many of them do I make? How to produce has to do with what technology do you use? How are you going to make the product? What are the type of resources do you have for you to know how you're going to make the product? Okay? So, and why do they have to make choices? Because there's always scarcity of resources. So you always have to make choices. You don't have unlimited resources, so since whatever at one point in time, at that moment you have a certain number of resources, and given that you have to make choices, and i.e. a study of economics. Okay? So just moving out so that you can look at this. Okay, a few minutes. All right. So if you have to make resources, if you have to make choices, because there is always scarcity of resources, if you have to make choices because there's always scarcity of resources, that means there's always going to be an opportunity cost. Always going to be an opportunity cost if you're not at the point of efficiency. In other words, there's always going to be an opportunity cost if you're at the point of efficiency. You're using up all your resources. So what I mean by that is you have $100. You go to the store. If you are thinking, okay, I have $100 to spend. Well, I can only buy stuff up to $100. That's my maximum. That's my scarcity of my resource. That's my boundary. So you can get multiple things at different $100. You can, maybe if one thing costs $100 and some other product costs $100, you have to choose between one or the other. You have to figure out what it is that you give up. So every time you choose something, the word choice means what? At least two. So what are you giving up? And it's not everything you're giving up. What is the next best thing you're giving up? In other words, if you didn't make choice A with the resources that you have, you would have made choice B. That is your next best choice. So that means if you made choice A, you gave up choice B. So that's what we call opportunity cost. It's the opportunity that it cost you. And why is there always opportunity cost? Because there's always scarcity of resources. So the way we think of opportunity cost is what is the next best alternative choice? What is the next best alternative choice you gave up? Okay, what is the next best alternative choice that you gave up to make the choice at hand? In other words, to make the choice that you made, what is the next best alternative choice you gave up? So I'll just move out, we copy that, and then we will go to an example now. Okay? So let's say we have an example, right? So we're going to do an example. Okay? That you have an economy now where the economy is making, we're going to do it with two products because we want to draw a graph. So let's say the example of an economy making wheat and textiles. Okay? So let's say an example of an economy making wheat and textiles. So on one level they're making wheat and textiles. You wonder how is an and I'm just going to put numbers. This is basically a done at one point in time. What I mean by one time in time is all other things constant. So they know the amount of labor we have, the amount of capital, the amount of land, entrepreneurship, all that is known, all that is fixed at one point in time, that's not changing, and the technology, the how you make it, how do you produce, is all fixed at one point in time. So given all of that that is fixed at one point in time, and I mean one point in time, I don't mean like in a moment, I mean when nothing else is changing, everything else is constant. Okay? So now we want to figure out how much textiles and wheat we can produce, right? And remember, since using up all of the resources, so this is a table where now you're using up all of the available resources that you have at this moment in time. Labor, capital, land, entrepreneurship, you're using up all of the resources at this point in time. So in other words, what we're going to talk about when we do all about PPF is what we would think of as full production. Using up all of that and the technology available, you're now figuring out how much wheat and textiles the economy can produce. So let's say, I'm just going to move this a little bit here. So let's say if they make 0 billion bushels of wheat, you can make 10 textiles, okay? So 1 to 9, 2 to 7, 3 to 4, 4 to 0, okay? So let's say this is in bushels of wheat, billions of bushels of wheat, and let's say this is in textile pounds of clothing, okay, textile. So I'm just going to put A, B, C, D here for points, so when I talk about a particular point, I can tell you. This table is called the production possibility table. This table is called the production possibility table. And the production possibility table is all points of production that is possible using all available resources to its fullest production and technology. So that means you've used up the amount of labor, capital, and land that you have, and you've used it up to the maximum amount you possibly can, the most efficient amount you can. And of course, in reality, there's more than 5 points. This is just so that I could draw the graph. And you've come up with this combination. These are not dollars, these are quantities. So this is quantity of wheat and quantity of textiles, okay? So in other words, if using up all of the resources to its fullest production, you can make 2 wheat, the maximum textiles you can make is 7. If you can make 1 wheat, the maximum textile you can make is 9. So at this point, when everything else is fixed, your labor, capital, and land, you can't make, if you're making 3 wheat, you cannot make more than 4 textiles. You cannot make 5 at this point. Because you can if something changes, but if everything else is fixed, this is the maximum you can make with 3 and 4. Okay, and so forth. So I'll just move out. So you can copy this, and then I'm going to draw the graph. Okay, so let me draw the graph. The graph is basically the depiction of this table, the same definition, except it's depicted graphically. So if you were to draw the graph and plot it point by point, it doesn't matter where you put what. It's It's the shape of the graph that's important. So maybe you can put textiles here, and you can put wheat here, and if you were to plot the points point by point, you should get a concave looking graph, where this point here should be 10, and this point here should have been 4. But if you plot it point by point, you should get not a straight line, but a concave looking graph. This is how a normal PPF looks like. Most PPFs will have this bowed out shape or concave shape. This is what we call, this type of PPF is what we call a normal PPF. Okay, in some books they call this an increasing opportunity cost PPF. Okay, this is the type of PPF it is. Okay, so I'm just going to move out. And then we're going to go to number 7 of our outline to talk about this graph in this table. Okay, so let me erase this. Unfortunately, I have the small whiteboard, so I've got to keep erasing. Okay, so let's talk about number 7. We're going to talk about all about the PPF. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention. The PPF is called the production possibility frontier. And basically, it's the graph we just drew. Okay, it's the graph that depicts all possible points of production, right? Using up all of your resources, available resources to its fullest production and technology, okay? All right, so first thing I want to say is, when we drew this graph, right? I'm just going to draw it small here. This was textiles, and this was wheat. When you drew this graph, all points on this line, so this was number 10 here, and this should have been number 4. All points on this line, on the graph, are points on this table. Okay, the reason we call it frontiers, this is the maximum you can produce on this frontier. It's the maximum. You cannot go over the frontier at this point in time unless something else changes. So what I want to show you is all points on the PPF are efficient points of production. We call that all points on the PPF are efficient. The word efficiency in economics has a very specific definition. It means that that's you've done the best you can with the resources you have. You're in the fullest production, and you've used up all available technology given your resources, the scarcity of your resources. You can't do any better. So that's what efficiency means, and on the graph that's depicted by you being on the line. So any point on the line. So if I say, is point C efficient? The answer is yes. Point B, A, B, C, D, E, all these points are efficient. That's the definition of how we came up with that table. Okay? But points below the PPF is called inefficient. Okay? Points below the PPF, if you are at a point F here, if you are at a point F, means you are inefficient. What does inefficient mean? It means you have the resources, you're just not using it up to its fullest productivity. So you have 20 laborers, but you're maybe only using 15, or all 20 laborers are not working to its fullest productivity. So that's kind of, or the machine is not working to its fullest productivity. So that means you're at point F. So point F will be inefficient. Okay? Point F doesn't mean you have a different amount of resources, because that would be a shift. That means you are, remember, at one point in time means if you have 20 laborers, the business has 20 laborers, and you drew the graph with 20 laborers working to its fullest maximum potential, and that's how you got these numbers. Point F means there's still 20 laborers, it's just that they're not working at the fullest potential. Okay? So it's an important distinction. If you change the amount of labor, that's different, then that's a shift. Here, this is not a shift. This just means you're under the graph, the company is not being efficient. It's inefficient. Okay? So that's point A. Point B points above the ppf are not possible, okay, unless there's a change. Okay, in other words, what we are meaning is, if you're at a point P here, point P is currently not possible. Why? Because of scarcity of resources. Your scarcity of resources says the maximum you can produce is on the line. So currently point P is not possible. You can get to point B, but that will be a whole different graph. Something has to change. And what has to change for you to be at point B? So you add a new point in time in a way. Okay? So for you to get to point B, you have to have a change. And what would that change be? Okay, so that's part C of the points I'm making. So you can change the ppf by doing one of two things. Either the change resources, or you have a change in technology. So when you change resources or change in technology, you will have a shift. The word shift in economics is very specific. It means the whole graph is changing. The whole graph is shifting. It's not a movement. Okay? You're not going from a point B to C or something like that. You're not moving. If you go from just one B to C, you're within the same graph, within the same scarcity of resources point. If you're going to a point P, right? If you're going to a point P, you're shifting the graph. It means it's a whole shift, right? You have a whole new graph. That's a shift. And when you're at point P, something changed. Either the amount of resources, you have more labor, all right? Something changed with your capital, you have more capital. You have change in technology, you figured out a new way to make the product that's more efficient, lower cost, so you shifted it, okay? And you can either shift to the left or right. In this case, I shifted to the right. A right will be an increase in ppf. You see that? When you shift it to the right, you have more textiles and more wheat. You can consume more of these products, so that's an increase in ppf. If you shift to the left, that will be a decrease in ppf. Okay, so this will be a right shift, okay? And a left shift will be something like this. Be a left shift. You have a decrease. You see, you have the quantities. You have to look at the axes and see the quantities are going down. Now here I showed the shifting parallel. Parallel means like just the same amount. It doesn't have to shift parallel. It can shift in any given way. It depends on where you are allocating or distributing the resources. So this is a shift left and right. I will just let you copy this for a second and then show you. You don't have to shift parallel. In other words, you can have a shift to the right, but it did something like this. You can shift this way. That means more of your resources were in textile and less of the change was in wheat. So as long as it shifts, there's a whole new graph, whether it's left or right. That is what we call a change. And that can happen when you change labor, capital, and land, increase, decrease, or when you improve technology. Okay, that's going to be shifted to the right, an improvement in technology. All right, so I'll let you copy that. And then we go to number D on all about the ppf. Okay. So the next thing I want to say all about the ppf is the opportunity cost. Let's talk about the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost, remember, was what you gave up. What is the next best alternative you gave up to make the choice at hand? So here the two choices. The choice is either whether they produce wheat or textile, and what quantity do they produce wheat or textile, using up all their resources. So if you notice one thing, when you have more wheat, they can only produce more wheat, going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, if they produce less textile. Why is that the case? And I didn't point it out earlier, but this graph is downward sloping. And it's downward sloping because of scarcity of resources. So all PPFs are downward sloping. they're always downward sloping. And why is it going to be downward sloping? Because there's always scarcity of resources. So, in other words, for you to have more wheat, for there to be more production of wheat, there has to be less production of textile. Have to give up one thing to get the other. That's opportunity cost. The way I want to do it is, I want to do it in terms of 1 unit gain. That way, whether you go from A to B, or you're going from this, whether you go in this direction or you go in this direction on the graph, whether you're going from E to A, when you do it with a 1 unit gain, you can compare the two because the gain is always 1 unit. Okay? So this is what I mean by that. Okay? I am going to define the opportunity cost specifically like this. Right? For a how much of one product is given up to produce 1 unit of the other product. Okay, how much of one product is given up to produce 1 unit of the other product? Okay, how much of one product is given up to produce 1 unit of the other product? So, what I'm going to do is we're just going to go from one point to the other, and I'm going to show you what you gain, make sure the gain is 1 unit, and then what you lose. Okay? So let's do the opportunity cost. Let me just call this OC for opportunity cost so I don't have to rewrite it again. So what is the opportunity cost when you went from A to B? If let's say you're producing at A and the production went to B. So what did you gain from A to B? You gained 1 wheat. What did you give up? 1 textile. From 10 to 9 is 1 textile. So the gain here is 1 wheat. And what did you give up? What did you lose? 1 textile. So remember, I want the gain to be 1. And the gain here is 1. In other words, you're saying to gain 1 wheat per unit. In other words, per unit wheat, you have to give up 1 textile. So the opportunity cost from A to B is 1 textile. Of course, 1 textile seems like a sound strange. Remember, in units, maybe this is 1,000 pounds of textiles, okay? Or 1 billion pounds of textiles, okay? Not 1,000, but 1 billion, okay? So, what is the opportunity cost then? Let's do another one. Let's do the opportunity cost from, let's say, B to D. It doesn't have to be consecutive. The production was at B and then it went to D. So that means what is the gain? You went from 1 to 3. Right, B to D. What is the loss? From 9 to 4, the loss is 5. So you put in the gain. The gain is 2. You have to give me the name of the product, and what did you lose? 5 textiles. Remember, I want it in terms of 1 unit gain. So this is not per unit wheat. So I'm asking you, if produce 2 wheat, the gain is 5, what is it per unit of wheat? In other words, you're going to divide both sides to get it per unit. So you divide 2 by 2 here to get it 1. So the gain is per unit. Okay, remember in algebra, what do you do on the left, you have to do on the right, so this becomes 5 over 2. So the answer here was 5 over 2 textile. Or if you like decimal, which is what I usually like, it would have been 2.5. Okay, I like it in decimal, it would have been 2.5. Okay? But you can leave it as fraction if you want. Okay? Alright? So that's kind of the example. So let me do one more where you go the opposite direction, because I don't want you guys to think the production is only in one direction. It could be in the other direction as well. Okay? So for a second here, and then I'm going to erase. Okay, I'm going to erase now. And I'm going to do it in the other direction. Let's do one more example. Okay? Let's do one more example on opportunity cost. What is the opportunity cost if you go from E to D? Okay, from E to D. So from E to D, you went from 4 to 3. The production is from 4 to 3 wheat. That's a loss of 1. The production is from 0 to 4 textiles. That's a gain. So in this case, it's the opposite. You have a gain of 4 textiles, say 4 billion pounds, and a loss of 1 billion bushels of wheat. Okay? So again, I don't want it in terms of how much you lose for 4, how much is the loss per unit. So you want to make this per unit, what do? You divide by 4, so you get it to 1. And what do you do here when you divide this side? You divide this by 4, so the answer is 1/4. So the answer here would have been 1/4. Or if you like decimals, you should write it as 0.25 wheat. Okay? Okay, so that's the opportunity cost. Okay? So the next point on all about the PPF is the shape of the PPF. Talk about the shape of the PPF. In this case, the shape was concave. Some books, they call this bowed out. Bowed out, I'm saying not bowed, bowed out. So, the shape of concavity, right, basically is due to something called specialization. It's due to something called specialization. And how do you know? Because of the increasing opportunity costs. Okay? In other words, the concept is like this. If you are when you go from A to B, you see let's do it in this direction where we are going from A to E. And it works in the other direction as well because you're now doing the opportunity cost per unit. When you go from A to B, you gain 1, you give up 1. B to C, you gain 1, you give up 2. Gain 1, give up 3. So what's happening? Here the opportunity cost is 1, then 2 textile, then 3, then 4. So what's happening as you move along the graph from one end to the other? How much production is given up increases. It's increasing opportunity cost. When you go from E to D, that will be the same case. You give up 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, and then you give up 1 here. So the reason why it's increasing is because what happens at point A? So you have, let's take labor for an example. You have labor that is hired to do both wheat and textile. So right now at point A, everyone is working in the textile side of the department, okay, of the company. So there are some people who are good at making textile and some are good at making wheat. And some of them who are better. You might be good at both, but you're better at one over the other. Right now at point A, all of the labor is making textile. Even the labor that's better at wheat is now making textile. So they're making some textile, not as good. When you go from A to B, you have to distribute some resources away from textile into wheat. So what happens when you take resources away from textile into wheat? The amount of textile goes down and the amount of wheat goes up. But who are you going to take away first? In other words, what labor will you redistribute from textile to wheat? The people who are, not as good at textile but better at wheat. So you're going to take the best wheat people, right? The best people who had the specialization in wheat and put them into production of wheat. So you still lost some textile because there's less labor, but not as much because they weren't as good. But what happens as you go down the line from B to C, C to D? Now you're moving more and more labor. Now you're moving labor that might actually be good at textile into wheat. So not only do you give up, but you give up a larger amount. It's called specialization. In other words, just because you're good at one job, doesn't mean you're as good as the other. So if you were usually trained for one particular position, you become, maybe as you get more and more trained, you become better at that position. Now, if they move you to another position, you may still do that work, but not as well. And that's the concept of specialization. And if two products require two different skills, the resources require two different skills, the labor is two different skills, then that graph is going to be concave. That's the shape. And it's due to the differences in skills and differences in specialization. What I mean by specialization, in your resources, okay? For an example like I gave in labor, okay? So that's why the shape will be concave, okay? All right, so we are done with this part of the lecture. Now let's go to the last part of the outline, which is number 8. The last part of the outline, which is number 8, I'm going to talk about different types of PPF. So what if you had a table like this? You know one type of PPF is the normal PPF. That's the PPF that has a concave or bowed out shape. Okay, remember that's the PPF that looks like this, the one that we've been doing. And why is this? Because of specialization between all of your resources. The skill level in your resources are different between the two products. Product X and product Y, let's call it, have required different specialization to produce. Okay, now what if you had a table like this? So let's say you have two products, let's call it X and Y again. But the table looks more like this, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let me just do 2, 4, I'm sorry, 10, 8, 6, 4, 2, 0. Okay? Same thing, it's a PPF table. Used up all of your available labor, capital, and all of your resources to its fullest production and technology, and came up with this table. Now, if you were to draw this graph, you would get a straight line. So you have product X and product Y. If you were to draw this, you would get a straight line. This is 5, this is 10 here, this would be 5 here, and you'd get a straight line. So this is also a PPF, a straight line PPF. Remember, this is an example of a type of PPF where the two products X and Y don't really have much differences. So in other words, the skill level for you to do one versus the skill level for you to produce the other are equal skills. It's something we call perfect substitutes, require equal skills. Okay? So for example, I can think of it, and for me and personally, it will be teaching macro, teaching micro. All right? So for me, teaching macro and teaching micro will be about the equal skills. Okay? So it could be any two products that require equal skills. In other words, there really isn't any differences in specialization. There is specialization, it might be a specialty product, but between comparing X and Y, that there isn't differences in that skill. Okay, comparing X and Y. Alrighty? Alright, so I just want to move out and let you copy that. Okay? Alright? And at the end of this, I just want to denote two particular definitions. One is called absolute advantage and the other one is comparative advantage. And we'll actually come back to this in a later chapter when we do trade. But I just want to put out the definition there. So when you do a job, if you are definitely much better at production of that one, if there's two different jobs or two different businesses or countries producing products. If one country produces something, wheat, more than the other country, that's what we call an absolute advantage, right? If country A can make, with the same amount of labor, capital, and land, if country A can make 50 bushels with all of your labor and capital and land, and country B can make 20 bushel, that means country A has the absolute advantage over country B. That's what we call an absolute advantage. If you can just make the product using the same level of resources better than the other country or more than the other country, that is an absolute advantage. Okay? Now, comparative advantage is you're not just looking at one product and see which country can make more wheat. Okay? If you do it with two different businesses, which two businesses can make more wheat? Or business A could make more wheat than business B. So business A has the absolute advantage. Comparative advantage is basically when you compare both products. So you have wheat and textiles. So now you're saying, comparing wheat and textiles, who can make wheat better than textiles? Comparing wheat and textiles, right? Who can make wheat better than textiles when you compare country A and country B, or business A and business B? That is what we call comparative advantage. So comparative advantage requires two countries, two products, or two businesses, two products. Okay, if you're doing it that way with businesses. Absolute advantage, you're just looking at one product between two countries. Okay, now we are going to come back to this in international trade. That's why I'm not doing a number example here. I just wanted to define it, even if it's confusing. Don't worry about it. We're going to come back to it in the last chapter in international trade, and we will do a number example there. Okay, thank you, and this is the last part of chapter 1.